It sure is nice to come home at the end of a long day and enjoy a podcast. But you know what makes the experience that much better? Relaxing with a few puffs of smoke from my McQueen pipe. At McQueenPipes.com, I was able to find the perfect smoking pipe to suit my nerdy, yet dignified sensibilities. I especially love that each pipe is designed and handcrafted by a true artisan, and that all of their pipes are inspired by fantasy books and movies like The Lord of the Rings. Being a bit of a hobbit myself, my pipe is called the Barrel Rider, but they've also got pipes for wizards, rangers, dragon riders, or even goblins. If pipe tobacco isn't your thing, no worries. McQueen Pipes has got you covered with attachments for vaping or even cannabis. Head on over to McQueenPipes.com and use the code BIOGRAPHERS at checkout to receive 15% off of your entire order. Go ahead. Treat your nerdy heart to something you'll cherish and enjoy your podcast listening experience in style with a McQueen pipe. That's Mac like mac and cheese and Queen like the band. McQueenPipes.com and use the code BIOGRAPHERS at checkout for a 15% discount on your whole order. Cheers, everyone, and happy podcasting.
I do hope you can see me today from where you are.
Ich bin ein Really.
If I'm generally anything, I guess I'm generally miserable.
This modern world of science and invention is of particular interest to women.
The people, I would say, there is no patent. This is... Would you patent the sun?
I regard myself as a soldier, though a soldier of peace.
Welcome to the Biographers.
I don't relate to you. Like, it's true. Like if you're a dude and like you're completely normal with shaving your face clean shaven and you have like an average build, like I'm not sure if we're on the same level. Like, because if I shave my face, I look like a caterpillar that's about to turn into a butterfly from Bug's
Kat
Life.
won't let me. She's just like, you look like a baby. Which I don't even think she means it like, oh, you've got a baby face. I literally think she's like, you look like you were just born. Like a chubby baby.
Yeah, Shalena won't let me shave my face. Not because of that. I think she's fine with that, but she hates the sensation of stubble. So like I would like shave and I would go over to like give her a kiss and she'd be like, ha! And I'm like, what? And she's like, I don't like it. I don't like the sensation. Get away from me.
Yeah, if my beard is too short, Kat will get like red around her mouth if we ever kiss because it's like, which I get. It's like stubble is, it's like sandpaper rubbing up against your skin. So I get it.
I'm not sure if you and I talked about this earlier, but I was having this conversation with my sister. We were talking about getting older and stuff like that. And it's really interesting because when I look at childhood photos of Shalena or childhood photos of my sister Gavi, they just look like grown-up versions of that child. But something interesting happens when you're born male where, like, in your 20s, your jaw starts to widen, your musculature changes, like your face shape changes, and then you also start growing hair on the bottom third of your face. And when you look at a photo of yourself when you're 16, you're like, I don't look anything like that guy.
I know. You
know, there's that sort of like little identity switch that happens when you get older where you're like, I'm a completely different person now. But I will say when I shave my face, I think I look more like my 5-year-old toddler self. Same thing, same situation. Yeah. I look more like my 5-year-old toddler self than I did like when I was 17 and could only barely grow a beard, you know?
Totally.
It's kind of one of those funny things where it's like, they don't warn you about that part. They're like, oh yeah, when you turn 20, you're going to look like a completely different person.
Totally. They've done studies and they've actually tried to figure out what it is in men specifically that people find the most trustworthy. Do you know what it is?
What?
A well-groomed beard.
Really?
When you have a well-groomed beard, there's something that happens in people's brains where they automatically assume you to be more trustworthy. Isn't that interesting?
That makes sense. I don't trust the way that I look when my beard is not well groomed. I look like a wild man.
I mean, you think about it, and I'm sure we could find some examples of it somewhere, but generally speaking, if you watch TV shows and movies, the villains are not big bearded guys. They're clean shaven.
It's true.
Well, hey everyone, welcome to the Biographers. I'm Daniel Newman. With me is Akiva Miola.
Hello.
And we're about to get started onto a brand new series. You probably already know who we're getting into from the actual title when you clicked on this episode, but I'll save it for Akiva to do a little build up and everything. Before we get going, a couple quick announcements, shout-outs, whatever we want to call them, agenda items. First and foremost, for anybody that is enjoying the show so far, we would humbly ask for your support on our Patreon. That's going to be patreon.com/thebiographers. We're also in the midst of a Kickstarter campaign that I have very little hope for, but hey, who knows? That is going to be Kickstarter.
Shout out to those $4 that are in there right
It's
now.
like $6. That is going to be, not Patreon, but kickstarter.com/profile/thebiographers. And there's some reward tiers there. And I also just wanted to give a quick little shout out to my Aunt Carol and her Etsy shop. She's doing a lot of cool different types of bracelets. And she's also started doing these really, really incredible hat feathers. So for anybody that wears brimmed hats, they're these amazing clip-onable kind of hat feathers. And I've never honestly seen anything like them. I have several of them and I get compliments on them literally all the time because I wear hats all the time and people are like, dude, where'd you get that feather? And I always go, my aunt made them. So you can go to her Etsy shop. It should just be etsy.com/shop/jackmystyle, like steal my style. So JACK, my style. So go check out her Etsy shop there and get yourself something nice and help support my lovely aunt, who's also a fan of this show. So hi Aunt CJ.
Hi.
And with that, I will hand things over to you, my friend.
Okay, so getting into it. We've often talked about the subversive ways that history over the years soaks into the cultural fabric of our modern lives today. Be it the idea that a spy is a debonair martini-drinking gentleman or walking into a gift shop to see quirky t-shirts with Princess Leia painted as the Mona Lisa, it's easy to forget that the effects of the past are still happening before our eyes. Out of all of the life stories I've read so far, I feel like our next subject is one of the most profound examples that real, bleeding history can be altered, slapped on a cereal box, and permanently cast into our cultural canon. From the mind of an 18-year-old girl toying with the idea of life and responsibility, we get the big green monster that terrifies us in a horror film or teaches us family values in the Munsters. At this point, it would be easier to categorize her work more as a theme than a book, since after over 200 years, the original thoughts, ideas, and even characters of her book have gone in all sorts of different directions. Born the daughter of two legends, her mind was given form by the groundwork provided by her parents, the harrowing stories of the past, and the incredible discoveries of her present time, writing, quote, "Every beginning must be linked to something that went before." While Joy wasn't entirely a stranger to her, she would live horrors of her own, whether it's the fantastical nightmares that made her dream of Frankenstein or her later years, which would cause her to lose many dear friends, leaving her to be a widow, admiring the dried human heart that she lovingly kept in her writing desk. Without further ado, let us reveal the true story of Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, the world's first science fiction writer and one of the most famous horror authors on the planet.
Ooh, you immediately had me open my mouth wide with a dried human heart, so I really want to get there. Holy moly. And no, everybody, this is not a true crime podcast.
I know. Well, I figured for sort of the Halloween season, I'd add a little bit more gravitas to the story. There's definitely some fun parts. It's going to be a fun and light in some parts and a little spooky in others, just because we're talking about the author of Frankenstein.
Totally.
You know?
Totally.
Before we get into her story, as always, I'd like to mention my primary sources for this season. My first and foremost is a 600-page tome aptly named Mary Shelley, written by Miranda Seymour, a British historian from the Royal Society of Literature. Seymour does an excellent job discussing nearly every friend, relative, letter, and decision that affected Mary. So if you're looking for an in-depth read, I'd highly recommend it. My second source is The Strange True Tale of Frankenstein's Creator, Mary Shelley, by Catherine Reef. If you're looking for a more brief, emotionally compelling read that cuts out the hard-to-understand 1800s jargon, I would recommend this one with a caveat. As I continue to read this one, it seems to me that this book is a little more than simply inspired by Miranda Seymour's larger book, and while she's cited in the bibliography, Reeves seems to be more like a Cliff's Notes version of her book. It almost seems a bit like plagiarism. I'm not going to lie.
Okay, interesting.
Like, as we go through, like, the quotes in her book are in the same order and like the exact same clips, the exact same pictures, the motivations, stuff like that. It just seems like she made this very large book, which, like I said, gets through all the ins and outs of Mary Shelley. If you really want to know her as a character, Miranda Seymour's is better. Catherine Reeve seems to have almost just taken that book and be like, let's make it so that a 16-year-old could read this.
Which has its place,
It
but
does,
I do understand what you're saying.
It should be a summarized version. It can't be its own thing unless the two have already discussed this. I don't know if it is plagiarism, but if Miranda Seymour doesn't know about this book, it's for sure plagiarism.
Ooh, fair
you know what I'm
enough.
saying?
Yeah.
Still a good book, and it helped me get through the larger arch of a lot of Mary Shelley's stories without having to be like, and then Mrs. Jefferson came by. Mrs. Jefferson was a tall woman, and she, we don't need to know every single side character of Mary's life, who she went shopping with.
Now, I will say, to give maybe just a little bit of grace to this person, in my experience reading through how many series I've done so far and using a couple different books, there are many times where one quote from like the actual subject
it's
or
just
whatever,
so good that you can't.
Exactly. It's like you're just like, dude, this perfectly sums up the thing that I want to drive home right now.
And it's not a different story. It's the same person. We're just doing a different biography in different lengths. So obviously the themes and ideas, those are subject to change, but the actual story and evidence-based points can be a little bit different.
Yep.
But getting back to Mary, in the heyday of Mary's parents, the United States had just recently gained their independence from their colonial oppressors, and revolution would spread across the world like wildfire. In South America, Simón Bolívar would free Venezuela from colonial oppression, Haiti would break free from their British shackles, and as a token from France, the key to the front door of the Bastille would be placed on George Washington's desk as a reminder of the inspiration they gave Europe.
I didn't know that.
Yes. As for the sciences, the Enlightenment era was coming to a close, offering new discoveries for the world to behold. Geniuses like Newton, Benjamin Franklin, Bernoulli, and Francis Bacon had worked diligently to uncover and unravel key truths about the world around them that Da Vinci also knew but didn't write about, as we know. This would also be the beginning of the study of something entirely new, electricity. Alessandro Volta would make the first recorded example of an electrical battery and have the measurement system volts coined in his name.
Oh.
As for biophysics, Luigi Galvani would discover that it was electricity that operated our nervous system, demonstrating this by shocking the disembodied limb of a frog to make it move.
Crazy.
Lord Kelvin, a scientist for whom the measurement of temperature is his namesake, was even famous for saying, quote, "There is nothing new to be discovered in physics now. All that remains is more precise measurement."
Huh.
Unfortunately, while the world had been enlightened in many ways, the scientific process had not reached a level of refinement that we would consider professional today. When it came to social sciences such as psychology, political science, and anthropology, it seemed that most researchers aimed to prove existing social conventions instead of criticizing their own biases. In politics, great thinkers like Edmund Burke would argue that monarchy was natural and revolutions were wrong because it breaks societal standards, which he believed all humans agreed upon. In the American South, so-called scientists would use phrenology, the study of the human skull, to determine someone's faculties to prove that white folks were mentally superior, in big quotes.
It's like in Django Unchained.
Yes.
When Leonardo does that whole bit.
As for Europe, male scientists would try to reaffirm their social order by stating that the female nervous system was hypersensitive, making women less rational and prone to hysteria. In 1791, France would have a hearing to figure out how the new education system would work, asking the British diplomat Charles Talleyrand for his opinion on the matter. Talleyrand would use the misogynistic science at his time to validate a system where men should receive a full classical education and women should be taught how to do household tasks like cooking and raising a child.
Of course, obviously.
Yes. Talleyrand writes, quote, "Let us bring up women, not to aspire to advantages which the Constitution denies them, but to know and appreciate those which it guarantees them."
This sounds like such an old-fashioned scientist thing. You know what I mean?
Literally.
Well, we can't quite treat women the same as their brains are much more fragile than our own.
That's literally what he's saying. He says, "Men are destined to live on the stage of the world, but the paternal home is better for education of women. They have less need to learn to deal with the interests of others than to accustom themselves to a calm and secluded life."
Oh, boy.
Shortly after, a woman named Mary Wollstonecraft would give a polite middle finger to Talleyrand and every other political misogynist in her essay, A Vindication of the Rights of Women, writing an eloquent 87,000 words on how, in almost every case, an example where women are seen as hysterical or ignorant is the result of poor treatment and a lack of education, not some biological difference.
Radical.
She also pokes a hole in Talleyrand's argument, saying that if women are expected to raise children and be uneducated, won't they simply just raise uneducated children? Mary writes, quote, "This is a false system of education, gathered from the books written on this subject by men who consider females rather as women than human creatures."
Jeez.
So,
and this is her mom, right? Mary Shelley's mom? Okay.
Yes, if you haven't figured it out now, Mary Wollstonecraft would not only be the mother of feminism, but also the mother of Mary Shelley. While Wollstonecraft had a massive impact on modern society, Mary Shelley's dad was no slouch either. As I stated earlier, in the time that Mary Shelley's parents lived, the world had experienced a shift in political ideology that was so massive, it affected more land than the fall of the Roman Empire. Wow. Colonies across the world were revolting, and the tentacles of imperial trade companies were being cut by revolutionaries by the dozen. In such a mind-altering time, it's no surprise that the late 1700s would nurture incredible new thinkers, including Mary Shelley's own father, who would be one of the most important contributors to political science in his time.
Jeez. I didn't know this either. I don't know like anything about Mary Shelley, so I should probably not say that anymore because most of this I didn't know.
I didn't know that either.
Yeah.
William Godwin was the son of a Calvinist, somewhat anti-royal family. After spending his childhood learning to become a priest, Godwin rejects Christianity as a whole, writing, quote, "Faith should be subordinated to reason," and begins his journey as a political writer. After the French Revolution broke out, Godwin would join a group called the Revolution Society, helping none other than Thomas Paine publish The Rights of Man.
Wow.
Godwin wouldn't become a household name in regards to political science until he wrote his magnum opus, An Enquiry Concerning Political Justice, in 1793. So, unlike the pamphlets of Thomas Paine, Godwin's book didn't dive into the current political views of the time, but instead looked at the underlying political philosophy as a whole. Godwin argued that injustice and violence produced the demand for government, but since closed governments become the only ones legally able to marginalize and go to war, it becomes the very thing it was built to destroy. It's saying, hey, these people are invading us, we want protection, and they say, we'll protect you, and then the people who protect you are the ones who oppress you. So that's kind of his argument against government as a whole.
It's like a system of irony.
Exactly. William Godwin thought that the transition from a governed people to a direct democratic anarchy should be slow and fairly nonviolent. As the people became more moral and logical, the need for government to regulate society would slowly become unnecessary. Nonetheless, young, bright-eyed enthusiasts living under active oppression by the crown wanted to help move things along, and as a result, homemade reprints from his book would circulate with anarchist groups all across Europe. His ideals place him now as the father of the modern anarchist movement.
Wow.
Yes. Which I really like that idea of anarchy being like, so we made this system of government in order to regulate things, right? But if those regulations are now harmful, then what is a police force except a threat of violence if I don't conform to societal standards that I never agreed to, right? And that's the same thing with the crown. He's like, so you're saying that these people 400 years ago managed to, get this castle by murdering a bunch of people, and now they made the rule saying, hey, you can't murder people to get castles. And he's like, that's patently unfair, and that's not how society should work, right? It's just maybe, I know we try not to get very political on this podcast, but I
think
talking about
anarchy is fine and whatnot. But I will add, probably pretty briefly, it reminds me of people that will go, well, I'm not really Republican or liberal. I'm more of a libertarian. And I always think to myself, have you really thought this through? Because essentially what you're saying is you want so little government oversight that you're pretty much left to be able to do whatever you want to, which basically means more companies can be more predatory.
Well, that's his
more
thing too.
Independent things can be more predatory. Everything gets more predatory when that happens.
That's the problem, is when you have no government, then I feel like just by nature, systems that are government-like will be produced because they're like, well, I could take advantage of people now that there's nothing to stop me.
Exactly.
And that was his argument. He was like, if businesses are behaving like governments, they should also be democratic. So businesses should be democratic. Governments should be democratic. Anything that could grow into something malignant should be organized through democracy, through direct democracy, not a House of Representatives. The people who are involved vote. If you live in an apartment complex, you vote on how much the rent is based on property values. That sort of thing.
It's interesting.
And in lots of cases, it does work. It's just hard to sort of regulate because once again, the second that it stops becoming under direct democratic rule, or that the people who are voting become uneducated on what they're voting for, it turns into chaos, you know?
Well, and it's also direct democracies. They basically have found that they're like, it sounds really nice, direct democracies, where you as a citizen will have the ability to vote on every single thing, but then you're going to find out that in any given year, there are 700 things that you have to be voting on.
And you have to be a professional politician in order to keep up with
Right, and your brain is just like, I only have so much ability to keep up with these voting
things. Now, it's a little bit
but...
different in the 1700s when we're not necessarily as worried about public infrastructure and public education, stuff like that. Back then, it's like, what was the government for? It's like, what were you doing? You were not stopping crime. You were not like building roads, really. There weren't any public hospitals they could go to for free. It's like, what were y'all doing? Like, what's sort of the point there?
I guess at that point in time, I think through the 1800s, there was a pretty big like surge in governmental sort of legislation. I mean, I think of things
that's where a lot of the revolutions happen, like we were talking about.
Yeah, and I think things like a good example is the sewer system of London being created.
Yes,
right. It's like, well, we need something for this, and to take care of all the poop.
Yeah, the River Thames being like an actual cesspool. Thames.
British people will smack you for saying Thames.
The River Thames. The River Thames.
River Thames.
Thames. Hear from me? No, I'm just kidding.
The Thames.
Thames, not Thames.
River Thames.
Thames. Well, maybe y'all should just write it differently. You guys invented English. You have control over that.
I tease my in-laws a lot because if you look through like a map of the UK, the amount of places that are called like Stoke-on-Trent, right? And you're like, what is that? And they're like, oh, it's a town called Stoke and it's on the River Trent, so it's Stoke-on-Trent. And you're like, you can just call it Stoke.
There's not another one.
You don't have to be that specific about
which
it.
Stoke are we talking? No, I'm talking about the one that's on Trent.
Or I remember I asked my father-in-law one time, as I said, why is it called Cambridge? And he says, because it's on the Cam. It's a bridge over the Cam.
Really?
Cambridge. That is why it is called that. And I'm like, okay, that is very funny to me.
That's hilarious. As for how Mary Wollstonecraft and William Godwin managed to get together, the two would have the 1800s version of a When Harry Met Sally relationship. Their first meeting together didn't go great, with William Godwin thinking Mary was too overbearing, and Mary thinking Godwin was an overly kind fool. However, over the course of 4 years and multiple excursions with other partners, including the making of Mary's half-sister, Fanny Imlay, thanks to Wollstonecraft, the two began to warm to one another, eventually falling in love in 1796 when William read some of Mary's work, writing, quote, "If there ever was a book calculated to make a man fall in love with its author, this appears to me to be the book."
Oh, wow. So like she wrote something and he read it and was like, oh man, this is
wild.
This mind is making me.
They would have dinner parties and she's, by their standards, and even still by our standards to some extent, a radical feminist.
Okay.
And he is a radical anarchist. They're both in the political scene together, but like they're kind of arguing sort of different points. He also was a feminist, I would say, but they're both working on different issues in the political sphere. So the two of them didn't really jive when they first met. Like Mary Shelley was set on her course. Godwin was very set on his course. So the two of them didn't really get along until they actually started reading each other's work. And then they were like, okay.
But at this point, it's Mary Wollstonecraft.
Yes,
right?
Wollstonecraft. Yeah.
Okay.
Unfortunately, thank you, British people, for doing this. Why is everybody named after their parents? Mary has a daughter named Mary, and then William eventually marries another Mary. And then that Mary also has a daughter named Mary. So there's like
it's
five
a lot
Marys.
of European cultures. It's like in Italy, the tradition is for the child to be named after the father's father or the father's grandfather, I think is what it is. So you have like a ton of different Giuseppes, for example.
Yeah, it's like in my big fat Greek wedding, Nicky, 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 Nicky.
Nick.
And Gus.
I am Gus. Also, really quickly, I will say this kind of reminds me of Franz Liszt in that how we kind of commented on one or two of the women that he was most kind of entangled with people didn't consider them traditionally beautiful,
Mm-hmm.
but he was very attracted to their mind.
Yes.
And we kind of had that discussion about how oftentimes that can shift you when you kind of get to know somebody and they're awesome and brilliant. You're like, wow, they're kind of hot now.
You know, actually, as far as looks go, Godwin wasn't bad when he was younger. He kind of got like a little portly and, bulbous nosed towards the end of his years, whatever. And Wollstonecraft was drop dead gorgeous.
Really?
She was
Okay.
completely stunning.
Okay.
But she was just like a crazy, like free love feminist. So most people wouldn't touch her with a 10-foot pole. So, as I was about to say, both Mary and William were believers in free love, recognizing conventional marriage at the time to be a way to restrain women. They spent that season visiting and courting each other often, sparing little time before they got to know each other in a biblical sense. When news of Mary's pregnancy was certain, she was content to have the child on her own. But William was too kind to let her deal with the social implications of being an out-of-wedlock mother, so in March of 1797, the two would marry at the Church of St. Pancras, which is hilarious because neither of them were religious, but they have to do it in order to,
And I'm sorry, it's St. Pancras?
Pancras.
Okay.
Pancras.
Oh, St. Pancras. I was like, wow.
Pancras. I don't know. Even though they had been bound in holy matrimony, their marriage would be far from traditional. It seemed that the two loved one another desperately, but with both of them in their early 40s, it was hard to teach these dogs new tricks. Mary was already a famed writer with a child of her own from her last relationship, and Godwin was considered a legend in his field. Mary would still be as obstinate as ever, and Godwin self-admittedly lacked emotional intuition. They did, however, both believe that marriage, especially at the time, was a system to force women to be property and work in servitude, so instead, both worked full-time as writers and kept an open relationship, and would even sleep in separate buildings often.
Again, it reminds me of Franz Liszt.
Yeah. They were just polyamorous. They didn't have a word for it, but they were just polyamorous. They're like, there was nothing weird about it. They loved each other desperately. They wrote each other love notes. They cared about each other, but they were like, we're so individualistic that this is the way that I'm going to love you. And it's not going to be, I work under you or you work under me.
So did they actually have other true relationships with other people, or was it just sort of like having some fun?
They were devoted to one another, but also if a romantic interest popped in left or right, they didn't judge one another for it. It wasn't considered cheating.
Okay.
Right? They were just like, if you see somebody that interests you, that's totally fine. They might have there was one instance where Godwin didn't want Mary to court specifically with somebody that he knew. And he was like, well, why do you always have Jason over for dinner? And she's like, because I like Jason. What's the problem with that? And he's like, nothing. That sort of thing.
Right. Not possessive.
And she's like, okay, so what about that other Mary? And he's like, what other Mary? So
gotcha.
That was sort of the relationship. Like I said, polyamorous, sort of open relationship. After just 9 short months, William and Mary would welcome a healthy baby girl to the world. But unfortunately, there was a complication. Mary's placenta had not fully released, and in a panic, her midwife would call upon a male doctor, which Shelley specifically did not want. The doctor would, with bare hands, try to remove whatever placenta was left inside, causing Mary excruciating pain and infecting her with puerperal fever, also known as childbed fever.
Ugh.
Only 11 days later, on September 10th, Mary would pass as a result.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. Tragically, if the male doctor had never been called, the placenta would have passed naturally, and she likely would have lived.
Dude. It's again like Franz Liszt with his daughter with the whole birth process. And it was unclean process basically,
Yes.
and she got an infection and died.
Yeah. Yeah. Because the midwife kind of knew what she was doing. She just panicked and she called somebody. But the male doctor's like, well, that shouldn't be in there. Let me just get that all out. It's like, but you just let the biological process happen and the placenta would have naturally passed and she would have been fine, at least according to what we know. The founder of modern feminism now lies in a cemetery near where they got married, where soon, in a few years, Mary would be spelling her name, learning to read.
Dang.
After the death of his wife, William would publish the unfinished writings of Mary Wollstonecraft, as well as give an honest account of their relationship and how it functioned. In it, Godwin would talk about how they were both happy together while being polyamorous, and Mary's writings would continue to poke holes in the patriarchy, with herself being an example of a woman who was fully capable of doing intellectual men's work. As you might have guessed, the publication was a disaster, with critics accusing Godwin of being happily cucked by his wife, who the media painted to be a crude, man-hating, bitter nymphomaniac.
Yeah, it doesn't surprise me, honestly.
Yeah, he was like, so this is a relationship. We love each other. And let's be real. We've done enough biographies to know
this was not super uncommon.
This was not uncommon.
No.
They were just chill about it.
Yep.
While Godwin would keep in contact with his closest peers, his honest window into their once happy life would cost him his reputation and, in part, his livelihood, having lost his job as a critic in the local paper.
Dang.
William, by all accounts, did the best he could to raise the new Mary in his life in the way that her mother would have wanted. Wollstonecraft was one of the first educators of her time to promote what we would call gentle parenting, proving in her time as a teacher that she could produce well-adjusted, considerate children without any corporal punishment whatsoever. Mary emphasized that an effective parent was one that was logically trusted by the child, not simply obeyed because the parent had authority and power to inflict pain. As for young Mary's dad, William Godwin had experienced a brutal teacher in his youth, so he was perfectly fine raising Mary in a way that would have been considered soft by society standards. That being said, like many single parents at the time, William felt insecure about his parenting skills, writing, quote, "If only Mary were here to direct the infant mind. I am the most unfit person for this office. She was the best qualified in the world. What a change."
Oh, man.
Yeah.
Makes me sad.
Her whole life was education, you know? William would do everything he could to keep Mary's mother alive in her mind. As a toddler, Mary would play by her grave every week, learning to spell by tracing the carvings of her mother's headstone.
Oh, that's really morbid.
Yeah. She loved every written word her mom left behind, and she cherished her books desperately. Still, it would seem that young Mary was daddy's girl through and through, even dedicating her most famous novel, Frankenstein, to him. She often played with the idea of parenthood in a lot of her later writings, having been raised by a father who was trying his best to be intentional about his parenting. While Mary Shelley would note that William's downfall was his severe, scolding attitude sometimes, she still admired him. In a short story about a father-daughter relationship, we get an insight as to what the relationship might have been like. Mary writes, quote, "He never caressed me. If he ever stroked my head or drew me on his knee, I felt a mingled alarm and delight difficult to describe. Yet, strange to say, my father loved me almost to idolatry, and I knew this and repaid his affection with enthusiastic fondness despite his reserve. He was something greater, wiser, and better in my eyes than any other being. I was the sole creature he loved, and the object of all his thoughts by day and dreams by night."
That is very cute.
It's very
It's
cute.
very sweet.
She's like, he's stern, and I can tell that he's stern because he doesn't know what he's doing, and just me being around stresses him out because he thought he would have another person to help him.
Yeah.
But he loves me, and I can tell, so I love him back.
It feels very modern single parent.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like the entire sentiment behind it of somebody who's like, hey, especially somebody who loses a spouse, right? Who's like, I'm going to do my best not only as a parent, but I'm also going to try to do my best to honor what I think my deceased spouse would have wanted in this situation. You know, it's very sweet.
Yeah. And to some extent, he felt an extra sense of protection because his relationship with Mary Wollstonecraft was kind of brief and not fully fleshed out. And he felt like this was Mary's child, and now it was his responsibility to raise it in a way that Mary wanted. Not just because he loved Mary Wollstonecraft, but also because, I don't know, since they weren't together for 10 years or something like that sense of ownership with Mary might not have been the same. You know what I'm saying?
I do. I just think, maybe not just think, I would add to it, though, he was very lucky in that he pretty much had tomes of instruction manuals left behind by his wife, basically, where he could almost reference back to like an instruction book and be like, okay, yeah, she probably would have wanted this. You know what I mean?
In her deathbed, she finishes a book named Maria, which we'll talk about in the next episode, that basically a part of the book is about a character in it writing to a child that she knows she won't see anymore because she's about to die.
Wow.
And she finished those last pages as she was passing from this puerperal fever. And yeah, it's almost like an instruction book. Mary read these and felt like she had a part of her mother. Her mother played almost this ethereal, sort of angelic part in her life where she would like look up at her portrait at home and kind of idolize her in a way because of like just if all that's left is somebody's just most incredible writings, then there's no way that you could really see them as a three-dimensional person, especially if you're their daughter.
Sure.
You know?
It also, that book you're talking about and her writing it like that reminds me of like every after-school special ever where it's like, you know, oh, mom died, but she left me a videotape. And she's like, hi, sweetie, if you're seeing this video, it's because I'm now gone. And here's what I want you to remember. You know what I mean?
Yes. Really pulls at the heartstrings. While it's clear that William gave special attention to Mary, she wasn't an only child. She would be raised with her half-daughter, Fanny Imlay, and in 1801, a woman by the name of Mary Jane Clairmont, yes, that's a third Mary to keep track of, would move into the same building complex as them, bringing her children with her. Wow. Mrs. Clairmont was a huge fan of Godwin's work, and the two would get married the same year, giving Mary 3 new siblings to play with. Along with Fanny Imlay from her mom's side, Mary would now have Charles and Jane Clairmont to play with, along with William and Mary Jane's new son, creatively named William.
Oh my gosh, you weren't joking.
I'm serious. Jane Clairmont would end up being Mary's closest friend. Jane Clairmont, the daughter, would end up being Mary's closest friend out of the bunch, having been born around the same time. If you're confused about all the different Marys and Janes and Williams, don't worry. It won't sort itself out.
Now, and I'm assuming that you're going to call out differentiators as we go through.
So, because her name is Mary Jane Clairmont, I just go by Jane or Jane Clairmont.
Perfect.
And then the mom, I'll say her stepmother, Mary Jane.
Gotcha.
Right?
Okay, cool.
Now around 6 years old, Mary's new brother, William, had been sent to a proper school for education while the girls were taught by their genius father, as well as absorbing the knowledge of the people who came to visit. During Mary's younger years, William would have all sorts of people over, with his favorite subject to discuss being politics, science, and medicine. In the political world, Napoleon's forces would clash with the English, and based on Napoleon's endless victories, it remained to be seen who would win. In another instance, on a bitter, cold night in February, Mary would creep out of her room to hear her father's friend, a physician named Anthony Carlyle, tell the tale of Giovanni Aldini's latest experiments. Giovanni Aldini, an electrical scientist and sworn rival of Alessandro Volta, would try to prove the theory of animal electricity by taking the corpse of a hanged murderer and, with a machine consisting of 240 electrified metal plates, attempt to reanimate the killer's head.
Okay. You're telling me Frankenstein is kind of based on a true story.
Frankenstein is based on like multiple true stories because there's a lot of people who tried to do this shit when they realized that electricity could make your muscles twitch.
Okay. Wow.
Yeah.
This is so, man, like, I can't call it medieval medicine, but like whatever you want to call this era of medicine, post-Enlightenment medicine and stuff is
science,
so
alchemy mixed.
Macabre, dude. It's so crazy.
Like, what can we electrocute? What can we take apart and stitch back together?
Right. And somebody goes, hey, why are you shooting electricity through this dead person's head? It's science. Basically.
It's just like the grown-up version of that like weird kid in your like neighborhood who would just like poke all the dead squirrels and be like, look at what I found, you know?
Right.
But then like grown up into science.
Seriously.
An observer would write, quote, on the first application of the process to the face, the jaw of the deceased criminal began to quiver, and the adjoining muscles were horribly contorted, and one eye actually opened. In a later experiment, the right hand was raised and clenched, and the legs and thighs were set in motion, and it appeared that the wretched man had almost been restored to life. After the test was done, again, later on, the murderer's fist would fly up and strike someone in the eye, terminating the experiment forever.
No.
Yeah.
Oh my God. Dude, Halloween spookiness, come on. This is crazy.
Spooky season. Okay. This story would have likely been told to Mary at some point, so we can pin it on our board of inspiration for Frankenstein.
Okay.
Mary's dad's friends tend to be odd folks, if not geniuses. One such guest would be an American who came in town in order to restore his wealth and reputation by the name of Aaron Burr.
Whoa.
That's right.
The traitor.
That's right. When Mary was a kid, she got to meet the former vice president of the United States, famous for besting Alexander Hamilton in a duel, which he just recently did.
Wow.
While there isn't much written about this encounter, Mr. Burr, sir, would write that Godwin had very fine children and a sensible wife, and would recount the time where William's son would give a speech called The Influence of Government on the Character of the People, which Mary wrote when she was 8. Her mother would have been proud.
Oh my gosh. Kids, let this be a lesson to all of you out there. You don't have to be an adult to be writing theses on political science.
Yeah,
Jeez.
also watch who your dad brings home, because it might have been the guy who murdered Alexander Hamilton.
I guess.
Yeah, so like his reputation was just completely destroyed. And so he's just like, I have to go to Europe in order to like let people kind of forget about me.
Wow.
And he, his wife Theodosia was like doing her own thing. You remember from the song. And he came to the UK and ran out of money and just started like kind of couch surfing with different political allies. And he was like, William Godwin's, no one likes him either, so maybe he'll let me sleep at his house.
Except it was England, so he was castle surfing.
Castle surfing. Although they lived in a place called the Polygon, which was an apartment complex. It was like a 10-sided apartment complex, and they had like a nice condo, but they didn't live in a castle or anything.
Okay, fair enough.
They were esteemed, and then after Mary Wollstonecraft's letter, they just were just so broke, so poor.
Gotcha.
Not like, I'm making nets on the side of the river poor, but like still pretty poor for a socialite.
Gotcha.
Right?
Gotcha.
While there are tons of information on how Mary was raised, what was Mary like? Well, all accounts tell us she was extremely spirited for a girl at the time, if not stubborn. More than once, Mary would argue with the rules of the house. Being a bit too smart for her age, she could easily point out the injustices of childhood, and William Godwin would complain that Mary would often stage rebellions, wrangling her siblings into childhood fights for freedom.
This is awesome.
As for the kids' education, Godwin would spend the next few years encouraging the girls to read whatever they wanted. Since he hated the old memorization textbooks, Godwin would begin writing his own children's books, often rewriting Bible stories or Greek tragedies into different, more relatable settings for kids to understand.
Interesting.
These children's books became so popular that he and his new wife would eventually open a little bookstore out of a small booth downtown, inviting his friends to write them as well. It was through this process of education and exposure to great thinkers that Mary would develop a mind of her own, giving us a glimpse into the person she would become. When Mary was around 12 years old, William Godwin and his wife Jane would pinch their pennies in order to move to a tiny little bookshop in a real brick-and-mortar store. The two would eventually rent out a large storefront where the family would live and take classes in the apartment above. The only problem was the location itself. Located at 41 Skinner Street, near the infamous Fleet Street mentioned in Sweeney Todd, the neighborhood had very little charm. In the morning, young Mary would watch a jeering crowd chase the jailers' wagons as they made their ways to the gallows for executions, and in the evenings, Mary would have to listen to the sounds of dying livestock as they were butchered for the next day's flayed merchandise.
Oh my gosh.
This would likely have made an impression on Mary's mind that would present itself later.
Yeah, but which, by the way, as we go through all of this, and you talk to me about like, oh, her playing on her mother's grave and listening to dying animals and hearing people talking about reanimated corpses, the image that's going up in my mind right now is 100% Winona Ryder from Beetlejuice.
That's kind of what I was picturing, like a Tim Burton. Think like a wispy Tim Burton girl.
Yeah,
right?
Like just like dressed in black and being like, no, mother, I will not obey you any longer. Like,
yes,
except father.
She liked to have fun. But it was almost like one of these situations where all of these stories and experiences, it's like, how could that not have made Frankenstein? There's almost that sort of level to it where you're like, so you're telling me that she experienced this direct thing that happened in Frankenstein and then this direct thing that happened in Frankenstein? No wonder she made that book.
Yeah.
The dirt under the nails appearance of this part of town meant that Godwin's books didn't exactly reach their target market. And while Mary's dad was rich with ideas, money seemed to be in shorter supply. The profits from the bookstore only made enough to keep the family fed, which made it even worse when, at 13 years old, little Mary Godwin had an unexpected decline in her health. Letters refer to the illness as an itchy red rash covering one of her arms. The simplest explanation was that the blood-filled drains and flies surrounding the butcheries near her house were spreading disease, but after understanding the family dynamics at the time, the reason is likely less dangerous and more subversive than that. It was no secret that Mary despised her stepmother, Jane Godwin. Mary's first few years of life were spent listening to her dad sing her dead mother's praises, and Mary had pictured a beautiful, calm, and intelligent woman when she thought of her real mother. On the other hand, her stepmother Jane had added 3 new siblings to the house, taken up her dad's attention, and even suggested to William that they should move to this rickety old building surrounded by slaughterhouses. Records show that Mary Jane genuinely cared for her, and even though she was hot-tempered, she looked after young Mary Shelley as if she were her own. All of that aside, this family drama matters because after looking into Godwin's medical records, it would seem that he also suffered from stress-related eczema, which is likely what passed on to Mary.
Oh.
So she's like, "You're not my real mom," and that was like causing some stress, moving to this place where it's like every morning I'm watching people like, "Oh, you're gonna go get hanged. I'm so excited to watch you get hanged." And then at night it's like animals dying, like, that stress was kind of getting to her a little bit. And it caused her to have this crazy eczema.
That's crazy.
So doctors of the time would recommend regular sea salt baths and poultices to reduce the rash intensity. So despite an utter lack of funds, Mary was sent to Miss Petman's Academy for Girls in Ramsgate, a town located by the ocean. So, after spending 12 years living with the father of modern anarchy, sneaking into smoking rooms to hear about Napoleonic Wars and reading about the latest advances in science, Mary would finally get to learn the important things at Miss Petman's, like how to speak French to impress your husband, how to have perfect table etiquette, dancing, drawing, and elaborate sewing.
What are all these forks for?
She's like, "I was writing political speeches and you're moving me to Miss Petman's?"
No, the third spoon is not for your soup.
What are you, an idiot?
That's for your jam.
Literally, that's kind of what happened. What's funny is Miss Petman, her character, she was very well-meaning and she cared for Mary deeply, but she was like, "I don't know what to do with this child."
I don't know who would, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Like, besides Godwin himself, really. Needless to say, Mary was bored out of her mind. There was nothing in this school that could keep up with her thirst for knowledge, and the stress of having to act like a toy only made her rash persist.
Ugh.
Luckily, when the semester ended, Mary Jane and William were not only too poor to pay for another semester, they were also too poor to have her stay at the Skinner Street house. In a 2 birds, 1 stone scenario, Mary's parents thought that the fresh northern air of Scotland could help with her rash, and living at someone else's house would help with their very tight budget.
Okay.
After a 6-day voyage, which Mary was seasick for most of the time, she was finally greeted by the Scottish town of Dundee. As she pulled in, she would have been greeted by rolling hills and moss-covered old-growth trees meeting up to stout docks, where shanties of whalers rang through the air as sailors came home or left for dangerous waters. See, a solid handful of these men would risk life and limb chasing whales up into the Arctic, and Mary would be told many a tale of those who explore the icy north, which would likely inspire the character Captain Robert Walton in Frankenstein.
And it's so here's another connection, my friend. I don't know if you caught this one either. Dundee is where Ian Fleming's ancestors were from.
Really?
That was his grandfather owned and ran a lint mill out of Dundee.
Oh, you're right.
Yeah. It's like you said that name and it was like a bell went off and I had to look at the map really quick to make sure it was where I thought it was.
Dundee.
It is. It's cool.
I know, it's good.
It sounds Australian, but it's cool.
Yes.
I guess because of crocodile. But anyways, yeah. So there we go. There's
Because
the
of
little
crocodile.
But there's the connection to Ian Fleming.
Yeah. So the family she was to be living with were the Baxters, who were old friends of William Godwin. Unlike her time at Miss Petman's school, Bill Baxter, the head of the house, was an avid fan of Godwin's work, so Mary was able to pursue knowledge just like she did at home, this time without the smell of pig's blood coming in through the windows.
Oh, well, joy.
She also became fast friends with Bill's daughter, Isabella Baxter, who dearly loved the writings of Mary's mother. She was a sharp-witted, brown-haired girl with a deep interest in the politics of the Napoleonic Wars, being noted for knowing all of the major players in this conflict. Isabella was a fan of paranormal places and morbid stories, and Dundee was chock full of them. When Isabella and Mary weren't studying, the two would read each other's Scottish folk tales, practice poetry, and even get into trouble together, having been caught scratching their names into a windowsill. It's likely that the two girls would test their bravery, sneaking away to the hanging mound at the end of Guthrie Street, where nearly 6,000 women accused of witchcraft were burned throughout the 1600s, or perhaps the dusty old house of Grizel Jaffray, whose supposed burial site attracts fans of the paranormal to this day. Like myself, Mary's teenage years were spent delighting in spooky stories.
Dude, the witches.
Yeah. 6,000 witches were burned in Dundee at some point during the whole, like we had the Salem witch trials here in the U.S. They had the same thing in Dundee.
No,
And
I know, but I think that's the thing that shocked me initially is that it's amazing to me that something like the Salem witch trials was so famous, and it was like all said and done. It was like, I'm going to be wrong on this number, but I want to say it was around 10 people maybe who were killed.
Yeah, I did the number, and I was like, are you sure it's not 60? And I checked multiple times. They're like, nope, 6,000. Like that's just
that is
if you had a witch, that's where you go to put it away. I guess
that is bananas.
And then if you go there, you can actually see like there's like a beautiful mosaic of like fire and a witch's pot and whatever, and it's like a testament to Grizel Jaffray, who kind of seems to be like the spokeswoman of all of the wrongly burned women, but people would go into her house because it was the house of a witch, and it was like a test of bravery, right? Like
and her
kids
name was
are like
Grizel Jaffray.
Yeah. That
is the sweetest name for a witch ever.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Grizel Jaffray.
Hello, I am Grizel Jaffray.
Like, yeah, and they would be like, I bet you won't go inside of Grizel's house. And she's like, okay, I'm going to do it. And like, that's kind of how, and they would tell spooky stories. And, Scottish folktales are just so full of spooky stories too.
Sweet, dude.
So as the stress of her home life went away, so too did the rash that had taken over her arm. The magical trip to Scotland as she's becoming a young lady would be a time in Mary's life she would look back on for decades with fondness, writing, quote, "It was beneath the tree belonging to our house, or on the bleak sides of the woodless mountains near, that my true compositions, the airy flights of my imagination, were born and fostered. I was in the area of freedom, in the pleasant region where, unheeded, I could commune with the creatures of my fancy. Adolescence was a dreamy, delicious period when all is unknown, and yet we feel that all is soon to be revealed."
I love her writing.
Mm-hmm. It's so beautiful.
It really is.
It's so beautiful. I was listening to Frankenstein, and it's like, I could sum up the story of Frankenstein in about half the amount of pages, but
the way that it's written.
Yeah. Because someone was like, it's just like a bunch of filler. And I'm like, you don't get it, man. You don't get it. Like the melancholic, beautiful Swiss Alps and the laboratory. It's like you're just enriching this world around you. Like even just that little thing where she was just like being in Scotland. I was like, I can totally imagine like a young girl with her hair flowing in the wind, wearing like a tartan dress, like writing her first little novels and stuff like that, which I desperately wish we had, but they're lost to history.
It's like you and I have talked about Jules Verne in the past and how it's like, if you read Jules Verne, I think the same exact thing is true. You could probably reduce his stories by about 50%, but he gives so many literal measurements on things and so many precise details about the mechanics and how they worked.
Vibes. You know what I'm saying?
It not only adds vibes, but it adds this sense of, it's like somebody was really actually there recording all of it. And then he's like the vessel for that information almost. It's amazing. So anyways.
Speaking of communing with the creatures of her fancy, it would seem now that Mary had come into herself. Her skin had cleared, and with her light brown eyes and blonde hair, she had gained the attention of not just a few boys, the first of which was the brother of her friend Isabella, Robert Baxter. As her time in Scotland came to a close, Robert would double down on his infatuation with Mary, vowing to come with her to London so he could pursue her hand in marriage. All the while, letters from back home would tell tale of a young man who would come calling at her father's door. With dark, messy hair and piercing blue eyes, Mary would soon meet a young Percy Shelley, which is where we will pick up in the next episode of Mary Shelley.
I feel like we're just getting cooking,
so
baby.
Good, right?
I'm
so
pretty
stoked.
into it so far, man. Awesome. This is a fantastic start. I really want to know where all this goes.
I know.
And how it's all building up.
What's so funny about doing a biography about a lady is like when you meet the husband, it's like his last name's Shelley. Like, her name is Mary Shelley. She meets a guy named Percy Shelley. It's like, oh, well, yeah, that makes sense.
Yep.
Technically right now her name is Mary Godwin.
Right.
But there's already a Mary Godwin, which is her stepmom. And then it's a mess. So I just say Mary Shelley just so everybody is like, okay, we know who we're talking about. Gotcha. And then Mary Wollstonecraft for her mom.
Gotcha.
It gets a lot easier in episode 2 because there's only like 3 main characters. So hopefully all of the British name intermingling will start to ease up a little bit. But man, yeah, something about her life. It's one of those situations like I said, just her exposure to these stories, just the fact that she was in in the right place at the right time. It's like, how could she not have written Frankenstein? And we'll get more of that in the next episode too.
She also reminds me of, and I know I always do this to you, and you're like, I don't know what you're talking about because I reference movies you've never seen.
Yes.
But there's a movie, it was Natalie Portman's first role. It was in Leon the Professional.
I wish I saw it. No.
It's a good one. It's kind of
wait. Is that with like he was like a hitman or something?
Yeah.
Okay.
And then like he trains her up to be basically a little hit girl or whatever kind of a thing. She almost reminds me of Natalie Portman's character in that she's very precocious, really smart, really aware, just that kind of,
yeah. And like
epitome of a precocious child.
Like she loves to read and write, and it almost for a second you're like, oh, she's gonna follow her mother's footsteps, get into like political science and stuff like that. And if you listen to her books, her takes on social situations are very. You can immediately be like, okay, so this is how she feels about. If you listen to Frankenstein, you know how she feels about the war with Napoleon. If you listen to Frankenstein, you know how she has sympathy for French immigrants who come to the UK after the war.
Okay.
Right. But for a second, you're like, okay, she's going to follow Godwin's footsteps, become, a political scientist, write stuff about politics. But she's still cooking. It's not like Da Vinci where it's like, oh, he's always going to make art and he's always going to do stuff because that's just what he's done since he was literally like 6 years old.
Totally.
Like, this is the only thing that interests him. He's just so set and focused. This is a girl finding herself.
Totally.
Right?
I'm sad that we don't have any of her books from when she was young or anything. Any of her writings were really.
She just thought she never published any of them because, and I think she got rid of some of them because she just was like, this is just basic stories. Like really, like think about a teenage girl now, maybe now instead of in a book, it's on, Tumblr or whatever, writing fan fictions or love stories. It's like, Dean and Sam, meeting characters from Harry Potter and they're kissing. Like that was kind of like sort of the vibes of her book. She was like, they're very childish. They were very like fanciful. But like she said in that sort of thing, she was like, my true compositions, the airy flights of my imagination were born and fostered in Scotland.
Interesting.
Right? So this is sort of the beginning of that growth.
And does Frankenstein take place in Scotland?
No.
I imagine it to be, if that makes
Frankenstein
sense.
takes place in Switzerland.
Okay.
In the Alps.
Okay.
But there is a scene where they go to England and they also go through Ireland.
Okay.
In the hunt for the monster.
Yeah, I just have this image in my head of Frankenstein and like the castle and just sort of we'll
talk about the castle too.
The misty sort of fogginess to it all. It feels Scotlandy to me, but anyhow.
That's fair. Oh, gosh, I'm so excited to talk about when we get to the episode. There's going to be one episode where it stops being quite as biographical and we'll start getting into just like the legacy of Frankenstein because it goes so many different directions. Like literally almost every single assumption we have about the story of Frankenstein, if you've never read Frankenstein and you've only just been exposed to Frankenstein through the cultural canon that we all live in, you don't know anything about Frankenstein because it's a similar theme, but so different.
First and foremost of which, and hopefully this isn't a spoiler or anything, Frankenstein is not Frankenstein.
No.
Frankenstein is the guy who makes the monster.
Yeah.
The monster is Frankenstein's monster.
Yeah, like he's not green. Like there's so many things that we could get into with it. It'll be excellent.
Cool, man. I am you got me stoked. I gotta be honest with you. I'm into this spooky tale, man.
I know. It makes me like cozy up with a hot chocolate or whatever.
We really haven't gotten in the biographers into anything even remotely spooky since really the first series with Mabel, because she was doing some like seances and stuff like that, and there was points where she thought certain houses were haunted and whatnot. So I'm stoked to get back into like little spooky stuff.
It's good.
It's super cool.
Her life, I'm a huge fan of her early life, which I think she would also agree with, because her later life stops being spooky and starts being like, aw,
sad. Okay,
but this sort of Frankenstein up to like her early 20s is just like peak like Halloween season. Like you just want to get like a pumpkin spice latte and just be like basic girl sitting on the couch with like your cardigan, just cozy up to it. It's good vibes.
It is also really funny to me. We've talked about this throughout different series, how certain stereotypes of characters ring true to modern times. And I wonder if you can relate to me on this. I feel like in school, anytime that there was a person, and it was a lot of times women that were goth girls, right? They had this thing about them that was like don't look at me, don't talk to me. But if you got to know them, you were like, you are one of the smartest people I know.
Yes.
Was that true for you as well?
Yeah, totally.
You know what I mean?
Totally.
And it feels like this is kind of how Mary Shelley was, that she was like kind of that goth girl that you said she has fun and she had some friends and whatnot, but I'd be willing to bet there was an element of her that a lot of other children were like, I don't want to get to know this person.
I didn't even add this. I wish I did now that you mentioned it, but she has some very like Wendy, jeez.
Oh, nuts, Peter Pan.
No, who am I thinking of?
Wednesday
Addams. Jeez.
Wednesday, that makes sense. Wendy, I'll allow that.
What Wednesday Addams sort of vibes, where there's one scene where she's with Isabella Baxter's oldest sister, which she did not like, and she knew that she was going to have a dinner party with somebody, and Isabella Baxter's older sister was still single. And they're at this party and they know that this new guy, Robert or whatever, is going to be there. And she goes, well, Claire, Isabella's sister, well, Claire, you know, you have to be careful when you go meet Robert because he's very affectionate. And the second you walk in, he's going to try to kiss you. And then she's like, oh, really? Like he's going to give me a kiss? And he's like, yes, it's just on the cheek, but he'll definitely do it. So just be aware of that. And she goes and she like gets ready and she gets dressed. And then she walks in and it's somebody that Mary has never met and does not kiss the girl. So then the older sister's like, why didn't I get a kiss? Like, what the heck is going on? And she would pull pranks like that all the time where like, if she saw like a girl who was very like flowery and like Mary Shelley's mom would probably consider her a toy. That's what she referred to. The people who were very much a product of like male-centric views, stuff like that. She would really mess with them. She would mess with them a lot.
It really does. I think Wednesday is a perfect example because I remember there's a whole scene in Addams Family Values, the second one from the 90s, where they're at summer camp and Wednesday is sitting around telling a story to all of the girls in her like cabin.
Yep.
And it's just this like horrendously macabre, dark story. And I want to say it has something to do with like a corpse and it like rises from the grave and the girls are just completely terrified, you know? So good call.
Like Mary is still friendly and like it is not like a total social outcast. She's not like goth in the sense that she won't talk to anybody. But I'm just saying if like Doc Martens were a thing and fishnets were a thing, I would imagine she would be rocking them. She'd be alt, if not goth.
Yeah, I was going to say, I imagine her to be the type that if eyeliner was discovered, she'd be like, give me lots of it.
That's the vibe. Like, I imagine like alt bookstore girl who like, you know, like maybe like a flower dress, but like, you know, like maybe like a black like cardigan and like some combat boots and like, you know, some stockings, a little half booky, half goth type vibe is kind of what I pick up from her sort of personality. But we're making total conjectures about somebody who's been dead for 200 years, but whatever.
Hey, it's fun to do.
It's fun.
Well, great job. Hopefully everybody enjoyed this first part of our series. It's looking like, according to kind of how you're at and your pacing and everything, it'll be probably 5 parts, maybe 6 parts. Yeah. But I'd be willing to bet that once you get into it, you're going to go, nah, I can get this done in 5.
We're trying to get this closed up in as much into spooky season, and then, you know, that's it.
And then move on into our next series, which I've already started into as well, which I'm very excited about. I won't tell you all about yet, but I think it's going to be a good one.
Dude, I'm so excited. I honestly just want to get through mine so we can listen to yours.
No. I am very, very excited by this one, dude. It's, again, we haven't really ever done anybody like this before. That's just a spooky kind of thing or whatever.
I was going to do Edgar Allan Poe, and I'm so glad I did Mary Shelley because I think we talked about this. I'm not sure if we talked about it on air, but
no, not on air.
His life is just a bummer. Yeah. His whole life is a bummer. He's like, the second he's born, both parents die. Immediate orphan. Moves to the South. Falls in love with the girl. She gets married. Marries his cousin, which is terrible. She leaves him. He loses his money, becomes an alcoholic, gets into gambling, and then just dies.
And I think his 14-year-old cousin dies too.
Oh yes, I forgot. She dies, and that's what gets him into alcoholism. And
which,
then,
if I'm not mistaken, in the poem "The Raven," the lost Lenore is a reference to his 14-year-old deceased wife cousin.
I think so.
Which is just a
cousin.
Terrible sentence.
His 14-year-old wife cousin. And it's just like, how could I feel bad for you right now? you know?
Yeah. No, I think that was a good call. We wanted to do somebody cool and spooky for the Halloween season. I think this is a perfect choice.
Yeah.
And now it's honestly already making me think of like, ooh, who could we do next year that would be fun and spooky?
I know. Yeah. The issue is always mostly the spooky characters are really sad. Mary Shelley's later in life stories are not a walk in the park.
Yeah.
But she still has, like I said, those early years are pretty fun.
Yeah.
It's like Harry Potter. The beginning first 3 movies are like fun. They're fighting trolls and stuff. And then you get to the end, it's Deathly Hallows. And you're like, well, this makes
Sirius
sense.
dies.
Yes.
Go to hell.
I know. He's my favorite.
He's everybody's favorite.
I feel like anybody who had some sort of parental issue loves Sirius Black. Like if you had like a dad who was like a little mean to you, or like in my case, my parents divorced. It's like Sirius was the cool uncle.
I was just about to say he was the cool uncle.
He was the cool uncle, being like, I know your parents are crazy, but come over to my place. I'll let you have a beer if you don't tell anyone. Like that type of
dude. You can have ice cream on weekday nights. You can stay up till 11 playing video games.
Your mom doesn't let you say that word. Say it whenever you want.
Yeah,
here.
exactly.
That's the vibe of Sirius.
That totally is the vibe of Sirius.
Okay, we're getting totally off topic.
We are. So we'll wrap it up there, everybody. Thanks again for listening. A couple things, again, to go over. Again, if anybody is able to support us on Patreon, if you're enjoying our show so far, go to patreon.com/thebiographers. We've already mentioned as well our Kickstarter. That's going to be kickstarter.com/profile/thebiographers. You can also find us on social media, places like TikTok, YouTube, and Instagram, generally going to be at The Biographers, with the exception of Instagram, which is at the.biographers. And then we'll also give obviously, like always, a shout out to Akiva's website. Go check out metalworkbymeola.com, MEOLA. That's for all of your chef's knives and general metalworking needs. He's been at it for a long time and he's very good at it. Go check it out. I will say I gave you a plug to a guy in the UK when I was going through one of my job interviews, because I told him that was a hobby of mine, and he was like, oh man, I'm actually looking for good knives. And I said, well, first and foremost,
that's awesome.
Go check out my buddy's website. And he was like, I don't know what import tax is, because he was in the UK. He was like, I don't know what import tax is to the UK.
Gosh,
but
shipping to the UK actually sounds a bit like a nightmare right now with all the knife laws right now.
Oh yeah, that's fair.
It's like just the laws are like so weird right now with like kitchen knives and stuff like that. If it looks remotely intimidating, they'll be like, nope, it's too pointy. Like,
and I hate to be sad and everything like that, but especially with some of the news stories that have been coming out of the UK as of late, I can imagine that actually being a pretty contentious sort of thing to be bringing into the country. So, and obviously, heart goes out to all those folks that were affected by sad things like that. But anyhow, we'll wrap it up here, everybody. Thanks again for listening. Hopefully you join us next week for part 2 of Mary Shelley. And as always, remember, ignorance is not stupidity, it's the absence of knowledge. And I do hope you all learned something today.
See ya!
You've been listening to The Biographers. For more information, please visit thebiographerspodcast.com.